******. Part 1 Riding Alone. *****. The wind was a living thing. It clawed at the chinking between the logs of the small cabin, shrieking like a banshee with a grievance against the world. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and the silence of a thing decided. On the rough-hewn table, between a flickering tallow lamp and a chipped porcelain mug, lay the document. It was not so much a contract as it was a bill of sale. Evelyn Hart, 19 years old, stared at the ink-scrawled paper. Her own name was there, a declaration of ownership passing from one man to another. She was the currency. "It's a good match, Evie," her uncle Jeremiah said, his voice a low wheedle that failed to hide the tremor of desperation. He ran a hand through his thinning, graying hair. "Caleb Ward is a man of means. A big ranch up past the Sentinel Pass. He needs a mother for his little ones, a wife to keep his house, and I need this debt cleared." He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on a knot in the floorboards. That was Jeremiah. He could trade his dead sister's only child to settle a gambling debt with a flick of the wrist, but he couldn't look her in the eye while he did it. "You promised him I would sign," Evelyn stated. It wasn't a question. The resignation in her tone was as heavy and cold as the iron stove in the corner. "He provided the paper, a formality, is all, for the county clerk." Jeremiah finally looked up, his gaze pleading. "This ain't the world you read about in your mother's books, Evelyn. This is Wyoming. It's hard, a woman alone. You haven't a chance. This is a chance, a roof, food, protection." Protection. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Protection from what? The world, or from the consequences of his own foolishness. She thought of her parents, taken by fever 3 winters ago, leaving her in the care of her mother's only brother. She thought of the small bag of seeds her mother had left her, whispering of a garden she might one day plant. A garden needed land. A life needed a foundation. Jeremiah had gambled theirs away. "The children," Evelyn said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the wind's howl. "What are they like?" Jeremiah seized on the question, his relief palpable. 2 of them. A boy, Luke, maybe 8, and a little girl, Annie, about 6. Their mother, she passed last spring. A difficult birth. Ward's been managing on his own since. He pushed the pen toward her. The ink was frozen in its well. He had to hold it over the lamp's chimney to thaw it. The smell of heated metal filled the small space. Evelyn picked up the pen. The wood was smooth and cold against her fingers. She looked at her name, *Evelyn Hart, *. In a moment, it would be a promise, a binding. She would belong to a man she'd never met, a family that was not hers, in a place she had never seen. Freedom was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was the only coin she had left to spend. With a steady hand that betrayed none of the turmoil in her heart, she signed the paper. The scratching of the nib was the only sound. When she was done, she pushed it back across the table. "He expects me by the end of the week," she said, her voice now stripped of all emotion. "For the wedding." Jeremiah nodded, folding the paper with fumbling, eager fingers. "The preacher's making his circuit. Ward arranged for him to be at the ranch on Saturday. You'll have to leave at first light tomorrow. The pass can be treacherous this time of year." Evelyn rose and went to the small window, rubbing a clear circle in the frost. Outside, the world was a swirl of white, a leaden sky pressed down on a land already buried in snow. *Riding alone. She thought. The phrase settled deep inside her, a cold, hard stone of truth. The dawn broke not with light, but with a lessening of the dark. The sky was the color of slate, and the air bit at any exposed skin with teeth of ice. Bess, her sturdy buckskin mare, snorted plumes of steam into the frigid air. her warm breath the only sign of life in the frozen landscape. Jeremiah helped her strap the small canvas roll behind her saddle. It contained her only other dress, her mother's worn Bible, and the precious cloth bag of seeds. "You're a good rider. Evie, you'll make it before the next storm hits," he said, his attempt at reassurance falling flat. He handed her a small sack with a lump of jerky and a handful of hardtack. She swung herself into the saddle, the cold leather creaking in protest. From this vantage point, she looked down at her uncle. For a moment, she saw not the man who had sold her, but the broken, frightened man beneath. But pity was another luxury she couldn't afford. It was too heavy to carry over the pass. "Goodbye, Uncle," she said, and turned Bess's head west without a backward glance. The journey was a battle against the elements. The wind was a constant adversary, pushing and pulling, whispering threats in her ear. The snow, soft and deep in the drifts, hid treacherous ice and rocks beneath. Evelyn rode with her head down, the brim of her worn hat pulled low. Her world shrunk to the space between Bess's ears. On the second day, as she navigated the lower switchbacks of Sentinel Pass, she saw them two riders, dark figures against the blinding white. They wore the heavy coats of the Union Pacific Railroad Patrol, the iron rails, a new and brutal scar across the ancient land. "We're not far from here." They reined in as she approached, their faces ruddy from the cold, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Ma'am," the older one said, his voice raspy, "that's a hard trail for a woman alone." "I'm expected at the Ward Ranch," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice even, her gaze direct. She knew how things looked. A lone woman was either in trouble or trouble herself. The man's expression softened slightly. "Caleb Ward's place, that's another day's ride, and the sky's looking heavy. There's an old line shack 2 miles up, just off the trail. You can shelter there for the night. There's a stove and some dry wood stacked inside." "Thank you," she said, her voice tight with gratitude. He nodded. "Be careful, ma'am. The wolves are hungry this winter." She found the shack just as he'd described, a small, dark box half buried in a snowdrift. Inside, it was frigid and smelled of rust and old soot. But it was shelter. As dusk bled across the snow, turning the world a deep, bruised purple, Evelyn coaxed a small fire to life in the pot-bellied stove. She fed Bess a handful of oats and rubbed her down, her own fatigue a dull ache in her bones. Huddled in her blanket, chewing on a piece of jerky that was as tough as boot leather, the full weight of her solitude pressed in on her. She was a ghost in this vast, indifferent wilderness, suspended between a life that was over and one that had not yet begun. She was no longer Jeremiah's niece. She was not yet Caleb Ward's wife. She was just Evelyn, alone. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny, defiant ember of resolve began to glow. She had survived this far. She would survive the rest. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. She saw the ranch the next afternoon. It lay in a wide, wind-scoured valley. A collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings, a long log house, a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a web of corrals. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the immense white backdrop. There was no beauty to it, only a grim, functional strength. It was a place built to endure. As she rode into the yard, a man emerged from the barn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy sheepskin coat and worn denim. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, his steps sure-footed on the packed snow. This had to be Caleb Ward. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze assessing. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with the lines etched around his eyes. They were gray eyes, calm and serious, and they gave nothing away. He looked at her, then at Bess, his eyes lingering on the mare's condition. "You're Evelyn Hart," he stated, his voice a low baritone, as steady and plain as the land around them. "I am," she said, her own voice sounding thin in the vast silence. He gave a curt nod. "You made good time. The preacher arrived this morning, holed up from the storm." He gestured toward the house. "Put your horse in the barn. There's an empty stall and feed. I'll take your roll." There was no welcome, no warmth. It was an instruction, an order given to a new ranch hand. Evelyn dismounted, her limbs stiff and aching. As he took the canvas roll from her, their fingers brushed. His hand was rough and calloused, the touch impersonal, yet it sent a strange jolt through her. She led Bess into the welcome warmth of the barn, the air rich with the smell of hay and animals. As she was unsaddling the mare, she saw them two small faces peering around the edge of the barn door. A boy with his father's serious gray eyes and a determined set to his jaw, and a smaller girl with wide, fearful blue eyes, half hidden behind her brother. The boy, Luke, stared at her with open suspicion. The girl, Annie, looked like a startled fawn, ready to bolt. They were the reason she was here. They were to be her children. They looked at her like she was an invader. Evelyn offered a small, tentative smile. "Hello." Luke's scowl deepened. He grabbed his sister's hand and pulled her back, out of sight. The heavy barn door scraped shut, leaving Evelyn alone with the horses and the hollow feeling of being utterly unwelcome. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The wedding was as stark as the winter landscape. It took place in the main room of the ranch house, in front of a large stone hearth where a fire roared against the storm that had finally broken outside. The wind howled, rattling the window panes. A wild chorus for the strange ceremony. The preacher was a thin, tired-looking man with a book and a weary voice. Evelyn stood beside Caleb Ward, who smelled of leather and the cold outdoors. He had not said more than 20 words to her since her arrival. She wore her other dress, a simple gray wool, and felt 1,000 miles away. The two children stood near the hearth, their faces scrubbed, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. They were witnesses to the transaction. "Do you, Caleb, take this woman, Evelyn, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked, his voice droning on. "I do," Caleb said, his voice firm, resolute, a promise made, a deal sealed. "And do you, Evelyn, take this man, Caleb, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Evelyn's gaze drifted past the preacher to the window. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. She was snowed in, trapped. This was her life now. The garden she dreamed of felt like a fantasy from another world. First, you had to survive the winter. Asterisk live first, dream later, she told herself, a silent, desperate vow. "I do," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind crying down the chimney. The preacher declared them man and wife. There was no kiss. Caleb simply gave a small, formal nod. He turned to the children. "This is Evelyn now," he said, as if that explained everything. "She'll be staying." Later, after a silent meal of beef stew and hard biscuits, Caleb showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It was clean and sparse, containing a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden chest, and a single window that looked out into the swirling darkness. "This will be your room," he said, standing in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. "The children's room is next door. I sleep at the other end of the hall. Good night." He turned and walked away, his bootsteps fading down the hall. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. She was a wife, a stepmother. She was Mrs. Caleb Ward, and she had never felt more alone in her entire life. Outside, the storm raged, burying the world in white, and miles away, in the dim, smoky light of the saloon in the nearest town, the first whispers were already beginning, the whispers about the reclusive rancher, Caleb Ward, and the young virgin bride he had bought himself a bride traded, they would say, for the price of a clear title to a disputed stream and a piece of precious land. The rumors were taking root, like bitter weeds in the frozen ground, ready to sprout with the spring thaw. ************************************************* Part 2. The House Without Windows ************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈̈ pre-dawn cold that seeped through the floorboards and settled deep in your bones. There was the sharp, clean cold of the air outside, so brittle it felt like it could shatter. And then there was the cold that radiated from the two small children who shared the house with her, and the quiet, closed-off man who was now her husband. Evelyn learned the rhythms of this new existence quickly. She was the first to rise, her breath pluming in the darkness as she stirred the embers in the kitchen stove back to life. The house was a creature of shadows in these early hours. One morning, creeping past the children's room, she heard a muffled sob. Pushing the door open a crack, she saw Annie, a small lump under a heavy quilt, her small body trembling. Annie, Evelyn whispered, holding her lantern aloft. The soft light spilled into the room. The girl flinched. "The shadows have faces," she whimpered. Evelyn's heart ached. She thought not as a mother, a role she didn't know, but as a girl who had once been small and afraid herself. She sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a careful distance. "My mother used to say that shadows are just the dark trying to tell a story. You just have to listen to the right parts." She didn't press further, simply leaving the lantern on the floor. Its flame turned low, a tiny sun to hold the dark at bay. She saw Luke watching her from his own bed, his eyes narrowed slits of mistrust in the dim light. He said nothing. His silence was a wall she met every day. He performed his chores with a sullen efficiency, pointedly ignoring any instruction she gave, looking only to his father for approval. When she mended a tear in his shirt, he left it folded, untouched, choosing to wear a more tattered one instead. Each small act of defiance was a thrown stone, and Evelyn was learning to build a shelter for her heart out of them. Caleb was a different kind of silence. He was a constant presence, a force of nature like the wind, but just as unreadable. He worked from before sunup to after sundown, his energy boundless. He was not unkind to her. He simply wasn't. He existed alongside her. They shared meals in a silence broken only by the scrape of forks on plates. She saw him sometimes, staring out at the vast, snow-covered plains, his gray eyes clouded with a memory she could not access. She knew she was living in a house haunted by the ghost of his first wife, a woman who had filled the silences that now yawned between them like canyons. 2 weeks after her arrival, a wagon pulled into the yard, drawn by a stout gray pony. A woman of about 60, with a face as lined and kind as a well-loved map, climbed down with a surprising agility. "Hello, the house," she called, her voice clear and strong. "Brought some preserves for the newlyweds." Caleb met her on the porch. "May, good to see you." A rare warmth touched his voice. This was May Albertson, the woman the preacher had mentioned, the town's midwife, herbalist, and repository of all knowledge, spoken and unspoken. She bustled inside, bringing a gust of cold air and a palpable energy with her. Her sharp, intelligent eyes took in Evelyn in a single glance. "So you're the one," May said, her tone frank but not unkind. She handed Evelyn a jar of gleaming peach preserves. "Caleb Ward's a good man. Child, a quiet one, but solid as the mountains. He just needs time." While Caleb was out in the barn, May sat with Evelyn at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot coffee. It was the first real conversation Evelyn had had in weeks. "The town's buzzing. You know," May said gently. "They don't mean harm, most of them. They're just starved for news that isn't about the price of beef or another blizzard coming." She paused, her gaze steady. "They're saying your uncle, Jeremiah, was deep in debt to Jeb Morrison." The name was unfamiliar. "Who is that?" "Owns the big sheep ranch north of here. Runs it with his 2 brutish sons. He's been trying to get his hands on the water rights to your West Stream for years. Says the original survey was wrong." May leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Jeb's got friends in the county clerk's office. He's been buying up debt, squeezing folks. The rumor is he forgave Jeremiah's marker in exchange for you, and for Jeremiah backing his claim on Caleb's water." The coldness Evelyn felt had nothing to do with the weather. She was not just a payment for a gambling debt. She was a pawn in a bigger, more dangerous game. "That can't be legal," Evelyn said, her voice tight. May took a sip of her coffee. "Depends on the paperwork. What was this marriage contract your uncle had you sign?" Evelyn described the single sheet, the hurried scrawl. May listened intently. "And you were 19, May asked. "No other guardian present, just you and Jeremiah." "Yes." May grunted. "Might not be worth the paper it's printed on. Child, a girl under 21, signing a contract under duress with her guardian who is himself a debtor in the arrangement. A good lawyer would call that coercion. It's shaky, very shaky." The information settled in Evelyn's mind, not as a key to an escape, but as the first solid piece of ground she'd felt under her feet since arriving. It was a sliver of power, a secret. The next week, the weather broke. A brief, merciful thaw. Caleb announced they were going to town for supplies. The trip in the wagon was long and mostly silent. Luke sat in the back, carving a piece of wood, while Annie huddled close to Evelyn, a tentative truce born of the shared warmth of a buffalo robe. The town of Laramie was a shock of life after the isolation of the ranch. The main street was a river of mud, lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon whose doors swung open to release bursts of rowdy laughter, a blacksmith shop that rang with the rhythmic clang of a hammer. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke from the distant train, a mournful whistle echoing from the edge of town. Men on horseback navigated the street, their spurs jingling, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hats. Newly strung barbed wire was coiled for sale outside the mercantile, a glinting promise of boundaries and disputes to come. The whispers started the moment they stepped onto the boardwalk. Evelyn could feel the eyes on her back, the way conversations paused as she passed. She was the ward bride, a curiosity, a piece of gossip made flesh. While Caleb conducted his business with the grain merchant, Evelyn took the children into the general store. The proprietor's wife, a stern woman with her hair in a tight bun, gave her a thin smile. Other ranch wives were inside. Their shopping paused. Their questions came disguised as pleasantries. "Made any apple butter yet?" dear one asked, her eyes scanning Evelyn's plain dress. Sarah Ward's apple butter was famous in 3 counties. "I've found the soil too hard for planting just yet," Evelyn answered calmly, refusing to be flustered. "A woman's touch is what that house needs," another commented, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It must be so difficult, with the 2 little ones not being your own." It was a gauntlet of 100 tiny cuts. They were testing her, judging her, trying to find the cracks in her composure. She met their gazes, answered their questions about herbs and stitches and bread-making, her voice even, her hands steady as she selected her goods. She was performing the part of Mrs. Ward, a role she hadn't chosen but would not fail at. As she was paying, a large man entered the store, his presence seeming to suck the air out of the room. He was broad and ruddy-faced, with pale, calculating eyes and a self-satisfied smirk. He nodded curtly to the other women, his gaze lingering on Evelyn with an unctuous familiarity, as if he were inspecting livestock he had recently purchased. "Morrison," the storekeeper's wife said, her voice tight with a respect born of fear. This was Jeb Morrison. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. He bought a twist of tobacco, paid the man, and walked out, clapping another rancher on the shoulder as he exited. Evelyn gathered the children and her packages, her heart pounding. She needed air. She told the children to wait on the bench outside and walked toward the side of the building, where a narrow alleyway offered a moment of quiet. But as she neared the corner, She heard voices. One of them was Morrison's. "The preliminary filing is in," he was saying, his voice a low, confident rumble. "The clerk agrees the old survey maps are ambiguous. Ward's been watering his whole herd off that stream for years. My stream." "Caleb won't give it up without a fight," another voice said. Morrison laughed. A humorless, ugly sound. "He's got no fight left in him since Sarah died, and now he's got his hands full with that little mail-order bride his new father-in-law provided. Don't you worry. By the time the spring melt comes, that water will be mine, one way or another." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She backed away from the corner, her face pale. This wasn't just a rumor. It was a plan, already in motion. Her presence here wasn't just quieting a debt. It was meant to be a distraction, a weakness in Caleb's defenses. The ride home was colder than the ride in. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and purple. But Evelyn saw none of it. Morrison's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, that water will be mine. She looked at Caleb, his profile stark against the fading light. He was a stranger to her, but his fight was now her fight. His home, for better or worse, was her home. An attack on this ranch was an attack on her, on the 2 children who sat in the back of the wagon, on the only sanctuary she had in the world. They arrived back at the ranch as full darkness fell. The air was still, heavy with the promise of more snow. As Caleb and Luke tended to the horses, Evelyn led Annie toward the house, and then she heard it. A dry, hacking cough from the cattle pen. It was a shallow, rattling sound that spoke of sickness. Another cough answered it from the darkness. Caleb froze, his head snapping up. He strode quickly toward the pen, lantern held high. Evelyn watched his broad back, the sudden tension in his shoulders, the whispers of the town, the threat of Jeb Morrison, the ghosts of the past, all of it faded away, replaced by a new, more immediate fear. A fear that could be carried on the wind, a sickness that could wipe out a herd and a family's future in a matter of weeks. The first sign of disease had come to the Ward Ranch. ###****, Part 3, Seeds Before the Storm, ****. The sickness began as a cough in the dark, but it spread with the insidious speed of a shadow. By morning, 3 more calves were afflicted. Their heads hung low, their breathing a ragged, frothy struggle. Caleb moved with a grim, controlled fury, his face a mask of stone. This was not just a sickness. It was an assault on his livelihood, a threat that could decimate the future of his herd. "It's the lung fever," he said, his voice flat as he examined a shivering calf. "Spreads like wildfire. We have to separate them." He and Luke worked with practiced efficiency, herding the sick animals into a smaller, isolated corral. The work was hard and the mood was bleak. Caleb's orders were sharp, clipped. He was a man fighting a war on his own ground, and he had no time for anything but the battle. Evelyn watched from the doorway of the house, a knot of helplessness tightening in her stomach. She was a stranger here, an outsider. What right did she have to interfere? But the memory of her mother, a woman whose hands were as skilled with herbs as they were with a needle, rose in her mind. Her mother had faced down fevers and fluxes with a quiet confidence and a store of remedies passed down through generations. She made her decision, walking purposefully to the barn. She ignored Caleb's questioning glance. "In my role," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have dried feverfew and colt's foot. My mother used it for coughs that settle in the chest. It loosens the phlegm." Caleb stopped, a bucket of water halfway to a trough. He stared at her. "This isn't a child with a sniffle. Evelyn, this is cattle plague." "Fever is fever," she insisted, meeting his skeptical gaze without flinching. "And a lung is a lung. It can't harm them to try. We can make a tea and mix it with their feed." He considered her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with the sounds of sick animals. He was a man who trusted in branding irons. good fences and the strength of his own back. He did not trust in weeds and women's remedies, but desperation was a powerful persuader. "Fine," he grunted, turning back to his work. "But don't get in the way." It was the smallest of concessions, but it was enough. For the next 2 days, the ranch became a field hospital. Evelyn kept a great pot of water simmering on the stove, steeping the bitter-smelling herbs until the brew was dark and strong. She and Caleb worked side by side, a silent, unlikely team. He would hold a calf's head steady while she carefully poured the herbal liquid down its throat. They cleaned the quarantine pen with lye and fresh straw, the acrid smell of the disinfectant mingling with the scent of hay and sickness. Luke watched her, his boyish face a mixture of scorn and grudging curiosity. But when she asked him to fetch more water or hold a lantern steady, he obeyed, his earlier defiance replaced by the gravity of the crisis. He saw that she was not afraid of the work, her hands as steady and capable as his father's. In the long hours, a subtle shift occurred. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with the shared purpose of their labor. Their hands brushed as they worked in the dim lantern light of the barn. He began to anticipate her needs, handing her a clean rag or a bucket of fresh water before she asked. They were no longer a man, a woman, and 2 children occupying the same space. They were a family fighting a common enemy. During a rare moment of rest, while the herbs steeped and the animals lay quiet, Evelyn unpacked the last of her meager belongings from the canvas roll. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was her mother's legacy, a small cloth bag tied with a faded ribbon. She loosened the knot, and the seeds spilled into her palm tiny, dark specks of promise. Marigolds to keep the pests away, hardy beans, sun-loving squash, and a few precious tomato seeds. Her mother had saved them from the best of her last harvest, telling her, "Wherever you plant your feet, Evelyn, plant these too. A garden is a way of telling the earth you mean to stay." The next afternoon, she found the place, behind the stable. There was a patch of ground the wind had scoured bare of snow. It was a hard, unforgiving plot of land, packed clay littered with stones. To anyone else, it was worthless. To Evelyn, it was a blank page. She found a rusty spade in the tool shed and began to work. The ground was frozen solid just below the surface. Each shovelful was a battle, jarring her arms and back. But with every rock she pried loose, with every clod of stubborn earth she turned over, she felt a fierce satisfaction. She was not just digging a garden. She was carving out a piece of this ranch for herself. This small square of earth would be hers, a place where she could cultivate life, not just endure it. Luke found her there, her face smudged with dirt, her breath coming in ragged pants. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone accusing. "Making a garden," she replied without stopping her work. "Nothing grows here," he scoffed. Pa tried. "The soil's no good." "Soil can be changed," she said, striking the spade against a stubborn rock. "You just have to be more stubborn than the ground." He stood there for a while longer, watching her relentless assault on the barren patch, before turning and walking away. The tide of the sickness turned on the 5th day. One of the calves was standing, its cough less ragged. By evening, another was attempting to drink on its own. The herbal tea hadn't been a miracle cure, but it had eased their breathing, broken the fevers, and given their own strength a chance to fight back. That night, for the first time, Caleb spoke the words. As they stood by the corral, watching the recovering animals in the moonlight, he turned to her. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "You saved them." The simple words were more profound than any vow. In the shared victory over the sickness, a fragile root of trust had taken hold. The change was felt inside the house as well. Annie, no longer seeing Evelyn as a frightening stranger, began to follow her around, a small, silent shadow. One evening, as Evelyn sat by the fire, mending a pair of Luke's trousers, Annie climbed into her lap, a quiet act of surrender and acceptance. That same evening, Evelyn took her mother's Bible from her room. Would you like me to read to you?" she asked the children. They stared at her, then nodded. She opened the book to the Psalms, her voice soft in the quiet room. Luke, who had been carving a piece of wood by the fire, put down his knife and listened. The cadence of her voice was a soothing balm in the silent house. Caleb came in from his final check of the barn, intending, as he always did, to take a plate of food and eat in solitude by the stables. He stopped in the doorway, listening. The firelight flickered across the scene, Evelyn with Annie asleep in her lap. Luke watching her, his face intent, the words of the ancient verses filling the room. He hesitated, then quietly walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He didn't eat, he just listened. The house was no longer 4 separate corners, but a circle drawn around the hearth. A week later, May Albertson's wagon reappeared. She took one look at the recovering calves and Evelyn's burgeoning garden plot and beamed. "I knew you had good sense in you, girl," she declared, pressing a jar of spiced apple butter into Evelyn's hands. While they shared tea, May's expression grew serious. She had news from town. "Jeb Morrison has filed a formal petition with the county magistrate," she said. "He's claiming the survey markers for the West Stream were moved back in the 60s. Says the water rights belong to his parcel, and your late father-in-law encroached illegally." "But that's our main water source for the summer pasture," Caleb said, his voice tight. "I know," May said. "The problem is, the county records from that time are a mess. A fire in '68 destroyed half the land office. Jeb's version is as good as yours without proof. What you need is an original deed, a personal letter, a journal entry. Anything from that time that mentions the stream as part of the Ward property." The threat that had been a whisper in a Laramie alleyway was now a formal, legal challenge. The fight for water was coming, and they were armed with nothing but their belief, as if summoned by the bad news. The very next day, the weather turned. The brief thaw vanished. A hot, dry wind began to blow from the south, a Chinook wind that leached the moisture from the air and the land. The remaining snow didn't melt, it evaporated, leaving the ground bare and thirsty. The sky turned a hazy, brassy color. A drought was settling in, weeks ahead of its season. The West Stream, their lifeline, dwindled. The steady flow that nourished the pastures shrank to a sluggish trickle. The cattle grew restless, their lowing constant and mournful. The air grew thick with dust, and the new green shoots in Evelyn's garden began to wilt under the relentless sun. The sweat on their skin evaporated instantly, leaving behind a salty, gritty film. Hope, so newly found, was beginning to wither. One afternoon, Caleb and Evelyn rode out to check a watering trough at the far end of the pasture. Fed by a small diversion from the main stream, they found it nearly empty, the ground around it a muddy mess. "The flow's too weak to reach this far," Caleb said, his jaw tight with frustration as he dismounted. He walked to the wooden trough, running a hand along its side. Then he stopped. He knelt, his broad back suddenly rigid. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, sliding from Bess's back. He didn't answer. He just pointed. She moved closer and saw what he was looking at. Near the bottom of the trough, almost hidden in the shadows, were 2 perfectly round, freshly drilled holes. The wood shavings were still scattered on the damp ground beneath them. This trough hadn't run dry from the drought. It had been deliberately, maliciously drained. They stood in the oppressive heat, the dry wind whipping Evelyn's hair across her face. This was not the indifference of nature. This was the hand of an enemy. An enemy who wanted not just their water, but their failure. That evening, a heavy, suffocating tension filled the house. After the children were asleep, Evelyn sat in her room, staring out the window at the moonlit, dust-choked landscape. She knew what this day was, by the quiet agreement of the town, of the world. This was to be the night she truly became Caleb's wife, The culmination of the contract. She steeled herself for the sound of his footsteps, for the turning of the knob. The footsteps came, slow and heavy in the hall. They stopped outside her door. She held her breath, but instead of the handle turning, there was a soft knock. She opened the door. Caleb stood there, his face haggard in the lamplight. He looked not at her, but at the floorboards, his hands clenched at his sides. "Evelyn," he said, his voice rough, this arrangement was for the children, to give them a mother. That was the bargain. He finally lifted his gaze, and his gray eyes were filled with a conflict she had never seen before. "I won't force you. A bargain is one thing, but a home is another. This won't be a real marriage until the day you choose it to be." *******, Part 4. The first night that changed everything, *****. The words hung in the still, lamp-lit air of the hallway. A quiet detonation that shattered the foundation of their arrangement. Evelyn stared at Caleb, at the raw, unguarded conflict in his gray eyes. He had given her a gift she hadn't known she was allowed to want a choice. "Come in," she said, her voice a near whisper. She stepped back, holding the door open. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before entering her small, sparse room. He seemed too large for the space, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He didn't sit, but stood near the window, his back partially to her, as if looking out into the dust-choked darkness gave him the strength to speak. The warm, yellow light from her lantern softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "When Sarah died," he began, his voice low and rough with unshed grief, "this house, it lost its heart. It was just walls and a roof. I kept working. The sun came up. The sun went down. The cattle needed feeding. The fences needed mending. The work is honest. It doesn't ask you how you feel." He turned to face her, his gaze direct and heavy. "But the children, they needed more than a roof. They needed a home, and I didn't know how to build one for them again. Not alone." He confessed that the arrangement with her uncle was a desperate, practical act. He had needed a woman's presence in the house, a mother for his children. He had treated it like he was hiring a permanent hand, one who would manage the domestic side of the ranch. "I saw you as a solution to a problem." "Evelyn," he admitted, the words costing him, "that was wrong. You are not a solution. You are a person. I see that now. I see it in the way you care for the calves, in the way you fight that stubborn piece of earth out back, in the way Annie has started to sleep through the night." The tension that had been coiled in Evelyn's spine since the day she'd signed that paper began to unwind. She had been a ghost in this house, a functionary, a name on a contract. For the first time, he was seeing her asterisk. "And what about you, Caleb?" she asked softly. "What do you need?" A shadow passed over his face. "I needed to do right by my children. I thought this was the way. I never intended to replace her." "I could never replace her," Evelyn said, the truth of it simple and clean. "I'm not Sarah. I don't know her ways or her recipes. All I know is how to survive, how to work, and how to be alone." She looked down at her hands, which were no longer the soft hands of a girl, but were becoming the calloused, capable hands of a ranch woman. "I was afraid that I was just another piece of property, something you owned, something you could use." He crossed the small room in 2 strides, stopping in front of her. He didn't reach for her, but his proximity was a comfort, a shield. "No," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "Never. This is your home. If you choose it, you are not a hand. You are kin. What you did for those calves, what you do for my children, that is the work of family." Tears she hadn't realized were gathering welled in her eyes. She had ridden here alone, prepared to be a wife in name, a servant in practice. She had built walls around her heart so high and thick that nothing could touch her. But his quiet words, his unexpected decency, had breached them all. He saw the tears and his expression softened, hesitantly, as if he were taming a frightened colt. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm, swallowing hers completely. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of connection, an anchor in the storm of her life. "I will wait, Evelyn," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "However long it takes, you will be the one to decide what this marriage is." She leaned into him then, a small, involuntary movement, and rested her forehead against his solid chest. The scent of pine smoke, leather, and clean sweat filled her senses. She felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear. He stood perfectly still, letting her draw comfort from him. After a long moment, his other arm came up, wrapping loosely around her shoulders, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary people finding a shared shelter in the quiet of the small room. When she finally looked up, he lowered his head and pressed a gentle, chaste kiss to her forehead. It was a promise, a pledge. It was a beginning. The night passed in a quiet peace. There was no longer a bargain between them, but an understanding. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The peace was shattered before dawn. A smell, sharp and acrid, cut through the cool air of the house. Smoke. Evelyn's eyes flew open. An unnatural, flickering orange glow pulsed against her window pane. Then came Caleb's shout from the hall, a raw, urgent roar. Fire! She was out of bed in an instant, pulling on her boots and a dress. The main room was filled with an eerie, dancing light. Through the front window, she saw it. The southern pasture, the one bordering the driest part of the creek bed, was a wall of flame. The fire, driven by the hot, dry wind, was moving with terrifying speed toward the barn. Caleb was already gone, a silhouette running toward the blaze with 2 buckets. Evelyn's mind raced. The children, the animals. She ran to their room. Luke was awake, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Annie was still asleep, whimpering as the smoke began to snake under the door. "Luke, get dressed, now!" Evelyn commanded, her voice calm and firm, cutting through his panic. "Get Annie's coat. We're going outside." She scooped the sleeping girl into her arms. Annie coughed, her small body limp. "It's all right, sweet girl," Evelyn murmured, her face pressed against Annie's hair. "I've got you." Outside, the heat was a physical blow. The roar of the fire was a hungry beast, punctuated by the crackle and pop of burning sagebrush. The sky to the south was a dome of molten copper, blotting out the stars. Tongues of fire licked at the dry grass, devouring everything in their path. Luke Evelyn shouted over the din. "Take Annie to the root cellar. Stay inside and do not come out. Do you understand?" The boy, who had defied her at every turn for weeks, simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the terrifying wall of flame. He took his sister's hand. "Come on, Annie," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "It's a game." Evelyn watched them disappear around the side of the house before turning her attention to the barn. The herd, frantic with fear, was crashing against the corral fences. The recovering calves were in a small pen closest to the house, their terrified bleats barely audible over the fire's roar. They had to be moved. She grabbed a heavy blanket from a line near the house, soaked it in the horse trough, and tied it around her face, the wet wool a scant protection against the choking smoke. She unlatched the gate to the small pen and, with a series of shouts and waves of her arms, began to drive the frightened calves out into the main yard, away from the encroaching flames. Caleb appeared at her side, his face black with soot, his eyes red-rimmed. "The wind is turning. It's going to jump the creek bed," he yelled. "We have to make a fire break." They worked with a frantic, synchronized urgency that needed no words. He rode Bess back and forth, dragging a heavy log to clear a desperate, hurried line in the dirt. Evelyn, armed with wet burlap sacks, followed behind, beating out the smaller embers that leaped across the gap. The smoke was a thick, burning blanket. It clawed at her throat, stung her eyes, and filled her lungs. The heat was relentless, blistering her skin, but she didn't stop. Beside her, Caleb fought with the strength of 10 men, his focus absolute. He was not just fighting for his land, he was fighting for the home he had almost lost once before. In the heart of the chaos, their hands met as they both reached for the same burlap sack. His fingers closed over hers, a firm, grounding grip in the swirling smoke and embers. He looked at her, and in that moment, through the fear and the soot, she saw a raw, fierce gratitude. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were partners, fighting side by side against the darkness. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, they finally gained the upper hand. The wind shifted again, and their makeshift firebreak held. The fire, robbed of its fuel, began to burn itself out, leaving behind a smoldering, blackened scar on the land. They stood together, exhausted, leaning on each other, watching the last of the flames die down. The air was thick with the stench of ash and ruin. Around them, the earth was black. Caleb walked slowly along the edge of the burn. He knelt, picking something up from the scorched ground. When he came back, his face was a grim, hard mask of fury. "It wasn't the wind," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He opened his hand. In his palm lay the twisted, melted remains of a kerosene can. Evelyn looked from the can to the ground, her eyes following a set of deep, parallel ruts in the dirt that the fire had failed to erase. They were wagon tracks, leading away from the burn, heading north, toward the property line, toward the land that belonged to Jeb Morrison. ###****, Part 5, Water and Blood ****. The ashes of the fire had barely cooled when the official wagon arrived. It carried County Commissioner Davies, a portly man with a self-important air and eyes that seemed reluctant to meet anyone's gaze directly. Jeb Morrison rode alongside him, his expression one of smug concern. A wolf dressing in shepherd's clothing. They stood by the shrunken west stream, the air still acrid with the smell of smoke. Davies held Morrison's petition in his hand, a flimsy piece of paper that held more power than the miles of land around them. "Mr. Ward," Davies began, clearing his throat. "Mr. Morrison has filed a formal complaint regarding the boundary of this waterway. He presents a surveyor's map from '72 suggesting this stream falls within his property line." "That map's a forgery," Caleb stated, his voice a low rumble. "My father and his father before him drew water from this stream. It's been ward land for 50 years. "Possession is not proof of title," Morrison interjected smoothly. "The law is the law. Your feelings don't change the lines on a map." While the men argued, their words a predictable dance of accusation and denial, Evelyn's mind was racing. Asterisk proof, asterisk May had said, asterisk a journal, a letter. She thought of the house, of the ghost of the woman who had lived here before her. Where would Sarah have kept her most private thoughts? Excusing herself, she hurried back to the house. She went not to the main living area, but to the bedroom Caleb still used. It was a place she had never entered. With a trembling hand, she opened the door. The room was neat, impersonal, but for a small, carved wooden box on the nightstand. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst a dried flower and a child's first tooth, was a small, leather-bound journal. Her heart pounded as she carried it back outside. She approached the men, her boots sinking into the soft mud by the water's edge. "Commissioner," she said, her voice clear and steady. This was Caleb's first wife's journal. She opened it to a page she had marked, the faded ink elegant and clear. Asterisk August 12th, 1865 asterisk, she read aloud. Asterisk, Father came today to help Caleb's papa set the new survey stake for the west pasture. They placed it right beside the great split oak, a marker no man could mistake and no flood could wash away. Papa said that with the railroad coming, a man must be certain of his boundaries. She looked directly at Davies. The split oak is still there, sir, half a mile upstream. Well within Ward property. This is a record from a time before Mr. Morrison surveyor ever set foot in this territory. For a moment, there was silence. Davies looked uncomfortable. Morrison's smirk faltered. Caleb stared at Evelyn, a look of stunned surprise and something akin to awe in his eyes. She had found a voice from the past to speak for them. A diary is not a deed, Morrison scoffed. Recovering quickly, it's hearsay, sentimental nonsense. Davies, clearly swayed by Morrison's confidence, nodded reluctantly. He's right, Mrs. Ward. It's compelling, but it's not legal proof. I'll have to take this matter back to my office for a formal hearing. The small victory felt hollow. They had a voice, but the law was deaf. 2 days later, in Laramie, the second blow fell. As Evelyn was leaving the mercantile, she saw him. He was thinner, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a guilt that seemed to have aged him a decade. Her uncle Jeremiah. Evelyn, he said, his voice a dry croak. What are you doing here? She demanded, the cold fury in her voice surprising even herself. He sent for me, Jeremiah mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Morrison, he wants me to testify at the hearing, to say that the marriage arrangement was part of a deal for the land, that Caleb knew the water rights were in dispute. And is that what you're going to do? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Are you going to lie for him? He's paying me, Evie, he whispered, the confession hanging like a shroud in the dusty air. He said he'd clear my name at the bank. He promised me a stake. He promised you 30 pieces of silver, she retorted, the biblical reference sharp and bitter. You sold me once. Uncle, don't sell my family's future now. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, a pathetic, broken figure caught in a trap of his own making. The town itself was falling under a shadow of a different kind. A dry, rasping cough could be heard from several houses. Diphtheria. The dreaded strangling angel of childhood had come to Laramie, the Hendersons' youngest boy. Timothy was the worst off. The doctor was miles away on his circuit, and fear was spreading faster than the disease. May Albertson, her face grim, found Evelyn in the street. I need help, she said, without preamble. I need someone with a steady hand and a strong stomach. The boy is burning with fever, and his throat is closing up. Evelyn didn't hesitate. For the next 2 days and nights, she and May became a fixture in the small, darkened room of the Henderson house. They boiled water, steeped horehound and sage to make steam, and held the struggling boy, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. The townswomen, the same ones who had whispered about her weeks before, now brought broths and clean linens. Leaving them on the porch, they watched Evelyn through the window, saw her tireless, gentle care, her calm competence in the face of sickness and fear. They saw not the ward bride, but a woman fighting for a neighbor's child as if he were her own. On the third morning, the fever broke. Timothy's breathing, though still ragged, was easier. He was alive. When Evelyn finally emerged from the house, blinking in the bright sunlight, a small group of women was waiting. Mrs. Henderson, her face streaked with tears, simply took Evelyn's hands. Thank you, was all she could say. No one whispered about her being a bargained bride that day. They saw her as a healer, a hero. The respect she had earned in the sick room, however, meant nothing in the world of men and money. The day of the hearing arrived, a hot, tense afternoon. Before they were to meet at the courthouse, Caleb had business at the saloon. Evelyn waited for him across the street and saw Jeb Morrison and his 2 hulking sons emerge. Morrison saw Caleb, and a sneer twisted his lips. "Ward," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Heard your new wife's been playing nursemaid. She'd better be good at it. You'll all be sick with thirst when I shut off that stream for good." Something in Caleb, held in check for months, finally snapped. He moved faster than Evelyn had ever seen him move, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply drew back his fist and struck Morrison squarely in the jaw. It was a single, explosive act of violence. Morrison staggered back, spitting a stream of blood into the red dust. "You'll pay for that," Morrison snarled, holding his jaw. "I'll take your water. I'll take your land. I'll take everything from you, by any means necessary." The hearing was a farce. The small county office smelled of pine floorboards, stale tobacco, and injustice. Commissioner Davies sat behind his desk, looking flustered. Jeb Morrison, a purple bruise already forming on his cheek, presented his forged map. Jeremiah, his eyes downcast, mumbled his coerced lies about the marriage agreement being tied to the land dispute. Evelyn presented Sarah's journal again, her voice ringing with conviction. Caleb spoke of the fire, of the kerosene can, but it was all circumstantial. It was their word against Morrison's paper and Jeremiah's testimony. Davies, a man who feared lawsuits and powerful ranchers far more than he valued truth, made his ruling. "Until an official state surveyor can come in the spring," he declared, the scratch of his steel pen on the order sounding like a death sentence. "A temporary injunction is placed on the Ward Ranch's use of the West Stream. All water must be drawn from the main river." It was a devastating blow. The main river was miles away. A full day's wagon ride for a single barrel. They could never water the herd that way. Morrison had won. He had choked off their lifeline. They rode back to the ranch in a heavy, defeated silence. The legal battle was lost. Their enemy had a stranglehold on them. That night, the house felt colder than it ever had in the depths of winter. Evelyn put the children to bed, their small faces troubled by the oppressive sadness they could feel but not understand. Evelyn lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the dry wind scratch at the walls of the house. Exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her into a restless, dream-filled sleep. It was Luke's voice that woke her, sharp with a terror that sliced through the night. "Papa, come quick." Evelyn was out of her bed and in the hall in a second. Caleb was already there, lighting a lamp. Luke stood in the doorway of his room, his face ashen in the flickering light. "It's Annie," he said, his voice breaking. "She's gone." Her bed was empty. A frantic search of the house revealed nothing, but on the porch, they found the evidence. A single set of small, shuffling footprints in the deep dust, leading away from the house. They led past the barn, past the scorched pasture, heading directly toward the parched, empty gully of the West Stream and the land that now belonged to Jeb Morrison. ###***, Part 6. The sandstorm rises, ****. The world had shrunk to the pale, dancing circle of a lantern's light. Beyond it, the darkness was absolute, a howling void where the night had been devoured by an approaching storm. Caleb, his face a mask of raw panic, was already saddling his horse. "He has her. Morrison has her. I'll tear his ranch apart board by board." "No," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through his frantic preparations with a surprising calm. She held up the lantern, illuminating the small, scuffed tracks in the dust. "Look, the steps are short. She's wandering, not being led. She's alone out there. If we both ride out, Luke will be here by himself. You stay. Light every lamp in the house so she might see her way back. I'll follow the trail." "In this wind, it's madness," he protested. "It's the only chance we have before the storm wipes her tracks away completely," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "I'm a better tracker than you are. Caleb, you know I am." It was true. In the weeks of mending fences and checking the herd, she had developed a quiet intimacy with the land. her eyes trained to notice the smallest details. He stared at her, his fear warring with the undeniable logic of her words. He finally gave a curt, agonized nod. Evelyn saddled Bess, her movements swift and efficient. She wrapped a thick scarf around the lower half of her face and pulled her hat down low, with a coil of rope slung over her shoulder and the precious lantern in hand. She urged Bess into the gathering wind, following the fragile path of her lost child into the maelstrom. Within minutes, the storm hit. It wasn't rain or snow, but the land itself rising up in fury. A wall of sand and dust swept across the valley, turning the air into a thick, gritty fog. The wind shrieked, a physical force that tore at her clothes and tried to rip the lantern from her grasp. The world became a maelstrom of brown and gray. Visibility reduced to less than an arm's length. The tiny footprints vanished instantly, erased by the scouring wind. She was blind, navigating by instinct alone. All she had was the direction the tracks had been heading, straight for the dead stream and Morrison's land. She bent low over Bess's neck, trusting the mare's sure-footedness, her own body a shield for the lantern's flickering flame. Sand pelted her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. It worked its way into her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. Every breath was an agony of grit. The lantern, her only beacon, began to sputter, its oil running low. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the chaos. Time was running out. She called Annie's name, her voice snatched away and shredded by the wind the moment it left her lips. She was shouting into a hurricane. It was hopeless. Despair began to creep in, a cold more bitter than any winter wind. And then she heard it, faint, high-pitched, and almost lost in the storm's howl, a cry. "Annie," she screamed, pouring all her strength into the name. The cry came again, closer this time. Evelyn dismounted, keeping a firm grip on Bess's reins, and stumbled forward, sweeping the dying lantern's light across the ground. The earth simply fell away into a black chasm. It was a deep, man-made drainage ditch, dug to divert runoff during the spring melts. Now a treacherous pit in the darkness. Peering over the edge, she saw a small, huddled shape at the bottom, 10 feet down. Annie. She had wandered, become disoriented in the darkness, and fallen in. "Annie, it's me, it's Evelyn, I'm here," she yelled. The little girl looked up, her face a pale smudge in the gloom. "I'm scared," she wailed. "I can't get out." The sides of the ditch were loose dirt and scree. Trying to climb them would only cause a landslide. Evelyn's mind worked with a desperate clarity. She looped Bess's reins around a sturdy sagebrush stump, speaking to the horse in a low, calming voice. Then, working quickly, she uncoiled her rope, fashioning a loop at one end. "Annie, I'm going to lower this rope to you," she shouted, her voice already hoarse. "You have to put it under your arms. Can you do that for me?" The small, terrified face nodded. Evelyn lowered the rope, the wind whipping it wildly. It took 3 tries before Annie managed to grab it and work the loop around her small body. Evelyn pulled the slack tight. "Hold on," she yelled. She couldn't pull the girl up by herself. She needed Bess. Unlooping the reins, she backed the mare away from the ditch, wrapping the other end of the rope securely around her saddle horn. "Easy, girl," she crooned, stroking the horse's neck. "Easy now. Walk." Clucking gently, she urged Bess backward, step by careful step. The rope went taut. Evelyn kept her eyes on the edge of the ditch, her heart in her throat, praying the rope would hold, that her knots were true. A small, dirt-covered head appeared over the edge, then shoulders. Annie scrambled the last few feet, collapsing into Evelyn's waiting arms. Sobbing and shivering, the lantern gave one last, heroic flicker and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. The storm raged around them, a blind, indifferent force. They couldn't make it back to the ranch. They needed shelter. Now. Clutching the child, Evelyn led Bess forward, stumbling through the sand-blasted darkness toward a faint, boxy shape she'd glimpsed before the light went out a shed on the edge of Morrison's property. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and half fell inside, pulling Annie and the horse in with her. The relative quiet within the small structure was a deafening relief. It was a storage shed, filled with the smell of grease, old leather, and something metallic. After her eyes adjusted, she could make out shapes in the faint moonlight that filtered through a grimy window pane. Sacks of feed, coils of wire, and a heavy wooden crate in the corner. As she was calming Annie, her eyes snagged on that crate. Stenciled on its side was a faded but distinct seal asterisk Laramie County Clerk's Office asterisk. Why would Morrison have official county property in his shed? Her curiosity overriding her exhaustion. She found a pry bar and worked the lid open. Inside were stacks of ledgers and papers. Most were ranch accounts, but one thin folio was tied with official red tape. She worked the knot loose. It was a collection of land deeds and survey maps, all dating back to the 1860s. And there, on the top, was the deed for the land encompassing the West Stream. She held it close to the dirty window, squinting in the faint light. The date of the filing was clearly written June 10, 1868 . But something was wrong. The ink of the 8 was slightly darker, thicker, beneath it. She could just make out the faint impression of a different number, a 5. The document had been altered. This was Morrison's proof, a forgery. Just as this realization dawned on her, she heard voices outside, muffled by the wind. Men were approaching the shed. Morrison's men. He said to check the valve again. One voice grumbled, "Make sure it's shut tight. Boss wants that Ward Creek bone dry." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She pushed the papers back into the crate, slid the lid on, and pulled Annie with her into the deepest shadows behind a stack of feed sacks. Her hand clamped gently over the girl's mouth. 2 men entered, carrying a lantern. They didn't search the shed, but went directly to a large iron wheel valve set into the back wall, a valve Evelyn hadn't noticed before. It was part of a hidden, illegal pipeline, designed to divert water from the stream before it even reached Ward land. One of the men gave it a perfunctory turn. "It's tight," he said. "Let's get back before this storm buries us." They left, slamming the door behind them. The next day, with the storm past and Annie safe, Evelyn rode to Laramie. She didn't go to the commissioner. She went to the deputy's office. Deputy Holden was a young, earnest man with a square jaw and an honest gaze that was a stark contrast to his superiors. She told him everything: the tracks, the rescue, the crate, the altered deed, the hidden valve. Holden listened, his expression growing grimmer with every word. "I've suspected Morrison was crooked for years," he said, "but he's got Davies in his pocket. A forged document isn't enough. We need to catch him in the act. Using that illegal valve is a state offense. It bypasses the injunction entirely." They formulated a plan, a trap. Holden would tell Davies he was investigating cattle rustling north of the Ward Ranch. That night, he and Evelyn would lie in wait by the shed. The night was clear and cold, the sky scrubbed clean by the storm, hidden in a cluster of rocks. Evelyn and Holden watched the shed. Hours passed, just as she was beginning to think they had been wrong. A wagon approached without lights. Jeb Morrison got out, along with 2 of his men, and with them, a 4th, hesitant figure. "Jeremiah." "Get it done," Morrison ordered. "Open it up halfway, just enough to drain their reservoir pool, but not enough to make the mainstream flood. I want them to wake up to nothing." As one of the men put a heavy wrench to the valve, Holden stepped out of the shadows. "That's far enough. Morrison," he said, his shotgun leveled. Morrison's men froze. Jeb himself just scowled. "You've got no jurisdiction here. Holden, this is a civil matter. Diverting water with an illegal pipeline during a county injunction is a criminal one," Holden countered. "You're all under arrest." Morrison laughed. "On what proof? your word against mine. No, Evelyn said. Stepping out from behind another rock, she looked directly at her uncle. On his... Jeremiah flinched as every eye turned to him. He looked from Morrison's threatening glare to his niece's steady, pleading gaze. He saw the girl he had sold, standing tall and unafraid against the man who had bought her. A lifetime of weakness and regret warred within him. "He's a liar," Jeremiah said, his voice shaking but clear. "He made me lie at the hearing. The real account books, the ones that show the payments to the surveyor who forged that map. They're not in the crate. They're hidden under the floorboards. Right there." He pointed a trembling finger at the shed. Morrison's face contorted with rage. He knew he was beaten. With a roar of fury, he shoved the lantern he was holding into a stack of dry hay bales inside the open shed door. "If I can't have it, no one can," he screamed. The dry hay went up with a whoosh, flames instantly engulfing the small structure. The fire, fed by the dry wood and the residue of lamp oil, exploded outward, a wave of heat and light. The wind, still brisk, caught the embers and carried them like malevolent messengers, straight toward the dry pasture that separated Morrison's property from Caleb's barn. As Holden subdued Morrison's men, Caleb, who had been waiting anxiously with Luke at the edge of their property, saw the new blaze. Without a thought for himself, he ran toward the corrals, yelling at Luke to stay back, intent on freeing the panicked herd before the fire could trap them. Evelyn watched in horror as a burning timber from the collapsing shed roof fell, striking a fence post and sending a shower of sparks across the dry grass, igniting a new line of fire right in Caleb's path. He was caught between the flames and the terrified, stampeding cattle, a lone figure silhouetted against a rising wall of fire. ###**, Part 7, Judgment Under the Open Sky, ****. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of heat, smoke, and the thunder of panicked hooves. Evelyn saw Caleb engulfed by the chaos, a lone figure struggling to force open a jammed corral gate as the fire raged behind him, and the terrified herd surged forward. A heavy, burning timber from the fence post, struck by the collapsing shed, crashed down, catching him a glancing blow on the head and shoulder. He staggered, fell to one knee, and was instantly swallowed by the tide of stampeding cattle. For a heart-stopping moment, Evelyn was paralyzed by a terror so profound it stole the air from her lungs. Then, instinct and a fierce, protective rage took over. While Deputy Holden wrestled a struggling Jeb Morrison to the ground, she grabbed a heavy blanket, shouting at a wide-eyed Luke to douse it in the water trough. "Holden, I need your help!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames. Together, they ran toward the inferno. The heat was a physical wall, but they pushed through it. The main herd had already passed, a river of terrified flesh disappearing into the darkness. Caleb lay crumpled and still on the scorched earth, dangerously close to the advancing line of fire. They reached him, Holden taking his shoulders and Evelyn his legs, and dragged him back, away from the heat, every inch a desperate battle. By the time they got him to the relative safety of the main yard, the entire town, it seemed, was arriving. The glow of the fire had been a beacon for miles, a signal of disaster that drew neighbors from their beds. They came with wagons, buckets, and a grim determination. They were ranchers, they were townsfolk, and they knew that fire was a common enemy that respected no property line. They formed a bucket brigade from the main well, their movements a disciplined, frantic ballet against the flames. Men shouted. Women's voices rose in encouragement, and the rhythmic slap of water against fire filled the night. Evelyn, her face streaked with soot and tears, knelt by Caleb's side, pressing a damp cloth to a bleeding gash on his temple. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. May Albertson appeared at her side as if from nowhere, her bag of remedies in hand. "Get him inside," May commanded, her voice the calm center of the storm. "The fire is for them. The man is for us." As the town fought the fire, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Holden, with Morrison and his men securely bound, had Jeremiah retrieve the hidden ledgers from beneath the floorboards of the now gutted shed. The proof, smelling of smoke but damningly intact, was now in the hands of the law. By dawn, the fire was out. The sun rose into a hazy, smoke-filled sky, revealing a scene of devastation. Morrison's shed was a pile of black, smoking rubble. A wide swath of pasture was a blackened, barren scar. But the ward's barn and house still stood, saved by the collective effort of the community. The people did not disperse. They gathered in the yard, their faces grimy, their bodies weary, their eyes fixed on Deputy Holden as he stood with his prisoners. Commissioner Davies, summoned from his bed, arrived looking pale and agitated, his authority utterly eclipsed by the raw, immediate reality of the situation. "There will be no formal hearing in Laramie," Holden announced, his voice carrying in the quiet morning air. "Justice will begin here, now." He arranged what would be remembered for years as the trial by the church. They convened in the open space behind the small, white-steepled building at the edge of town, a neutral ground between the ranches and the law. The sky above was a brilliant, pitiless blue. A makeshift judge's bench was fashioned from a wooden pulpit dragged from the meeting hall. The entire community stood as jury, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and grim expectation. Holden began, his voice clear and methodical. He laid out the evidence piece by piece on a rough plank table, the twisted iron of the illegal valve, the forged deed, its altered date now seeming like a pathetic, childish trick. And finally, the ledgers, their pages detailing payments to a disgraced surveyor and bribes to county clerks. "We have a confession," Holden said, gesturing to a pale and trembling Jeremiah. "He will tell you how he was coerced into bearing false witness." Jeremiah stumbled forward, and in a halting, broken voice, he confessed everything. He spoke of his debts, of Morrison's threats and promises, of the lie he had told under oath. He did not ask for pity, only for the chance to undo a fraction of the harm he had caused. Next came Morrison's ranch hands, faced with prison and abandoned by their employer. Their loyalty evaporated. One of them, a young man no older than Evelyn, spoke of the night of the pasture fire, of being ordered to spill kerosene. He described how they had drilled the holes in the watering trough. Their words were a hammer, nailing the lid on Morrison's coffin of lies. Then May Albertson stepped forward, holding Sarah Ward's journal. "Paper can lie," she said, her sharp eyes sweeping the crowd. "Maps can be redrawn, but the land remembers. Sarah Ward wrote of a marker, a great split oak. I ask any of the older ranchers here, Mr. Henderson, Mr. Albright, do you remember that tree?" Nods and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Two grizzled old ranchers confirmed it. The oak had been a landmark for decades, known to all as the corner of the original Ward homestead. May had turned a dead woman's words into living testimony. Throughout it all, Jeb Morrison stood defiant, his face a mask of contempt. "This is a circus," he spat, the ramblings of a bitter old woman and the coerced lies of cowards. "You have no proof." It was then that Evelyn, who had been standing silently at the edge of the crowd, walked forward. She had washed the soot from her face, but her eyes held the fire of the night before. She did not look at Morrison or at the commissioner. She looked at the faces of the community, at the Hendersons, whose sons she had helped save, at the other ranch wives who had once judged her, at the men who had fought the fire alongside her. "Mr. Morrison is right," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a surprising strength. "He believes there is no proof, because he does not see me. To him, I was never a person. I was a commodity, a piece of a bargain, the mail-order bride my uncle traded to settle a debt." A murmur went through the crowd. This was the gossip they had all feasted on, now laid bare by the subject herself. He thought that by installing a frightened, ignorant girl in Caleb Ward's house, he was weakening it. She continued, her voice gaining power. He thought he was planting a weed. He believed I would be a distraction, a burden. He did not understand that when you try to bury a seed, you might just be planting it. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over them all. Meeting every eye, I did not come to this valley to be a wife. I came here to survive, but I learned more than that. I learned to fight a sickness that was stealing the breath from your cattle. I learned to fight the fear in the heart of a child who is afraid of the dark. And last night, I fought fire to save the home I now claim as my own. She finally turned her eyes on Morrison, and they were like chips of steel. I am not a commodity. I am not a bargain. I am not the woman who was sold to this ranch. I am the woman who kept it alive, and this is my home. You will not take it. A profound silence fell over the yard. In that moment, she was not just Caleb Ward's wife. She was the conscience of the valley, a testament to a strength they had all underestimated. The silence was broken by Commissioner Davies, who, seeing the tide of public opinion turn into an unstoppable flood, finally found his courage. "Jebediah Morrison," he declared, his voice trembling slightly, "by the authority of Laramie County, I hereby place you and your associates under arrest for arson, illegal diversion of water, conspiracy, and perjury." As Deputy Holden snapped the iron cuffs onto Morrison's wrists, a collective sigh of relief, of justice served, rippled through the crowd. The injunction on the ward's water was officially rescinded. Jeremiah was sentenced to 6 months of labor, rebuilding the fences his actions had helped destroy, a chance to pay his debt not with money, but with sweat and repentance. The trial under the open sky was over. That afternoon, they brought Caleb back to the ranch. He was still unconscious, his body bruised, a deep cut on his temple stitched closed by May. Evelyn sat by his bedside in the quiet, sunlit room, changing the cool cloths on his forehead. Her hand resting on his. The house was safe. The water was theirs. The children were playing softly in the next room. They had won, but the victory felt incomplete, hollow, with the man she had fought alongside lying so still and silent. She must have dozed off, her head resting on the edge of the mattress. She awoke to a faint pressure on her hand. She looked up, her heart leaping. Caleb's eyes were open. They were clear, and they were fixed on her. The confusion was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet intensity. He tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. She held a cup of water to his lips. He drank, then lay back, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw the soot still smudged on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, the fierce loyalty that had never wavered. He lifted his uninjured hand and gently touched her face. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice gaining a little strength. "All this time, the paper, the contract, it was all wrong." He took a breath. "When I am on my feet again, will you marry me for real this time? No bargains, no deals, just you and me." ###***, Part 7. The new season of water, ****. His question, whispered in the quiet of the sick room, was not a proposal, but a prayer. Evelyn looked at the man lying in the bed, the man she had fought beside, whose children she had come to love, whose home she had defended as her own, and her answer was as simple and true as the beating of her own heart. "Yes, Caleb," she whispered, her hand tightening on his. "I will." Caleb's recovery was as steady and resolute as the man himself. He healed the way the land did after a fire slowly, with scars, but with an undeniable return of strength. The deep gash on his temple faded, and the bruises on his shoulder gave way to a familiar power. While his body mended, the valley healed around them. Jeremiah, true to his sentence, worked every day from sunup to sundown, his hands growing calloused, his back bent to the task of rebuilding what his weakness had helped tear down. He never spoke unless spoken to. his shame a silent, constant companion. The community, in its rough-hewn way, accepted his penance, offering him a dipper of water on a hot day, a silent acknowledgement of a debt being paid. The wedding was held a month later, on a Sunday when the spring sun was warm and the sky was a vast, cloudless blue. It was nothing like the first ceremony, a grim transaction held captive by a blizzard. This was a celebration, held under the open sky, on the very patch of land that had been fought for. The entire community was there, not as gossiping spectators, but as honored guests, as witnesses who had earned their place. The preacher, the same weary man from before, now had a genuine smile on his face. Caleb stood waiting, not in a heavy sheepskin coat, but in his best dark shirt, his gray eyes clear and fixed on the house. And then she came. Evelyn wore a simple cream-colored dress, sewn with the help of May and the Henderson women. It wasn't new, but it was hers. In her hair, she wore a crown of the first hardy wildflowers that grew along the banks of the newly flowing stream. Annie, her face alight with a joy that had been absent for so long, walked before her, scattering petals from those same flowers. And beside Evelyn walked Luke, no longer a sullen, mistrustful boy. He was a proud young man, and in his outstretched hands, he carried a small, carved wooden box containing the rings. As Evelyn reached Caleb's side, Jeremiah stepped forward. He did not look at Caleb, but at Evelyn. His eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. "This was your mother's," he said, his voice thick. He opened his hand. On his palm lay a simple, thin gold band. She would have wanted you to have it, not as part of a bargain, but as a gift, a beginning. He placed the ring in her hand. I can never undo what I did. Evie, I can only ask that you forgive me." Evelyn looked at the ring, a perfect, unbroken circle, a symbol of a love she had only known in memory. Then she looked at her uncle, at the broken man who had finally found the strength to be honest. "I forgive you, Uncle Jeremiah," she said, her voice clear. And in that moment, the last chain of the past broke and fell away. They used that ring, as Caleb slid the worn gold onto her finger. He did not speak the preacher's words. He spoke his own. "With this ring," he said, his voice low and steady for her alone, "I choose you every day." When she placed a matching simple band on his finger, she echoed his vow, "And I choose you." The celebration that followed was not a grand affair, but a simple, heartfelt gathering. There was music from a traveling fiddler, and tables laden with food brought by every family. Evelyn moved through the crowd, no longer an outsider to be judged, but a central part of their world. She was Mrs. Ward, a name she now wore with a quiet, earned pride. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. The water from the west stream, now gurgling and full, was diverted through a small, newly dug irrigation ditch that led directly to Evelyn's garden. She had been more stubborn than the soil, just as she'd told Luke. With water and work, the hard-packed clay softened. The seeds her mother had given her, dormant for so long, finally took root and grew with a fierce vitality. Green shoots of beans climbed up twine, squash blossoms opened like brilliant yellow suns, and the small, determined tomato plants began to show the promise of fruit. Her shovel, which had once felt like a weapon against the hostile earth, now rested by the corn rows like a patient friend. But her work extended beyond the garden. Seeing the eagerness in Luke's eyes when she read to him, and knowing how many other ranch children had no access to schooling, she cleaned out a small, unused storeroom off the main house, with a few planks for benches, a bucket of whitewash, and a stack of old primers donated by the preacher. She opened an evening school, 3 nights a week, by the light of a half-dozen lanterns. The children of the valley would gather, their faces scrubbed, their minds hungry. She taught them to read, to write their names, to do sums. She was not just cultivating a garden, she was cultivating a future. With May Albertson, she started something else. The long ride to a doctor was a danger every family faced. Using her mother's knowledge and May's deep well of experience, they turned another small outbuilding into a clean, organized first aid station. They stocked shelves with jars of dried herbs, feverfew for fevers, comfrey for poultices, yarrow to stem bleeding. It was a humble beginning, but it was a promise to the community that no one would have to face sickness alone. One evening, after the last of her students had departed, Caleb found her standing by the stream, the place where their new life had truly begun. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver path on the water that now flowed freely, its soft murmuring a constant song of life and justice. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, listening to the music of the water. "Do you remember what you said?" he asked softly, his lips near her ear. "That you knew how to be alone." "I remember," she whispered. "I don't want you to ever have to know that again," he said. "My vow to you, Evelyn, it's not just for Sundays, in front of the preacher. It's for here, now. It's to be the man who rides beside you, not in front of you. To be the walls of your home, not your cage. To love you, not for what you do for us, but for who you are." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his weathered face. In the moonlight, she could see every line, every scar, every bit of kindness and strength that made him the man he was. "And my vow to you, Caleb," she answered, her voice full of an emotion too deep for words, "is that I choose to stay. I choose this home. I choose this life. I choose you." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of ownership or of passion born of desperation, but a kiss of profound and tender recognition. It was the meeting of two souls who had been solitary for too long and had finally, against all odds, found their way home. It was a gentle sealing of a promise made under the vast, star-filled Wyoming sky, a quiet fade into a shared future. The sun rose the next morning on the Ward Ranch. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of the fire in the hearth, of a family awake and alive within. The water gurgled in the ditch, feeding the green, growing things in the garden. A shovel stood propped against a fence post, ready for the day's work. Life went on. At 19, Evelyn Hart had ridden into this valley alone, a girl bartered to settle a debt. But as she rode out that morning to check the herd, she was not alone. Caleb was beside her, his presence as steady and comforting as the mountains themselves. The barbed wire fences still marked the boundaries of their land, a reminder of the struggles they had faced. But now, the gate stood open. Freedom, she had learned, was not a thing you were given. And love, she now knew, was not a thing you could buy. They were the things you built, the choices you made, every single day. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to read your comments and see where you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and if you enjoyed it, please support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.